Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Billy Fitzsimons.
High-level officials from more than 170 countries are in Switzerland right now to finalise the first legally binding treaty on plastics. Negotiations began in 2022 when the United Nations Environment Assembly, that's the world's highest decision-making body on the environment, agreed on the need to address the environmental and health impacts of plastic pollution and waste.
Since then, 5 negotiation sessions have failed to reach a consensus. This time, protesters outside the UN are calling for courage, not compromise. But with a record number of fossil fuel lobbyists attending the latest round of talks in Geneva, there are concerns that global efforts could stall further. Dr. Nicholas Chartres is a Senior Research Fellow with the University of Sydney's Faculty of Medicine and Health. As a leading authority on the health impacts of plastic pollution and microplastics, he's part of a group of experts who have made several recommendations for the UN Plastics Treaty.
Nick joins us for today's deep dive to unpack everything you need to know about these negotiations and the current state of play. Dr. Nicholas, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
What, for people who are listening who might not have heard about this treaty at all, what is it and why is it being discussed right now?
Sure. So back in 2022, the United Nations member states adopted a resolution to negotiate the first international legal binding treaty to end plastic pollution. So this has been ongoing for the last 3 years. There's been a series of meetings to develop the language that would go into the treaty. So what it will actually do and what the member states will have to commit to essentially. And one of the main sticking points or challenges with this is that the majority of member states are wanting to cap plastic production, and they also want to end the use of known toxic chemicals in the production of plastics. Not many people realise that plastics are made from oil and gas, but they also have thousands of additive chemicals in them to essentially give them the characteristics that plastics have. And obviously there's lots of different types of plastics. And then there's a small coalition of fossil fuel producing and petrochemical producing member states that are pushing back against this idea of capping plastic production and also capping the use of these chemicals. And that's essentially because they want to see a focus on recycling and waste management so that they can continue to essentially produce and make plastic because it's such a huge revenue stream for them.
I want to focus in a little bit on the problems that the treaty is trying to solve. You've touched on there, but how urgent is a treaty like this? And can you tell us more about those problems?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think most people would just know from their own experience in their lived environment that plastic's becoming more and more of an issue. And I think in Australia, we have always thought we live in such a pristine and amazing environment, and we certainly still do. But I mean, you only need to take a walk on a beach or look at the streets or just look at your own house and look at how many plastic products are now in that environment. They're ubiquitous and they're everywhere. And these are the ones that we can see. So I'm talking about like the larger size pieces of plastic. And just to give you an understanding of how big the problem is, we make about 490 million metric tons of plastic a year. And it's sort of like, well, what does that look like? Well, it's doubled since 2008. And if you think it looks bad now, and if you think the beaches and the water, from your own experience, looks polluted, it's going to triple in the next 30 years. So we're going to triple plastic production in the next 30 years based on the projections that have been made on how the oil and gas industry are going to essentially use plastics as their new revenue stream. So as the world starts to transition away from energy and transport for a primary source of oil and gas, about 50% of oil and gas will be used by 2060 for making plastic. So it's going to become an even bigger issue than what we're currently experiencing. What I mentioned before about the plastics that you can see, I mean, that's one thing. And so we think about plastics often, and we've grown up thinking about plastics as these larger pieces of material that we can pick up, put in a recycling bin, and essentially just magic happens and we get new products made from them. And that's what we've been told. It's a story, a narrative that was shaped by the fossil fuel industry back in the 70s and 80s, that we can recycle our way out of this problem. About 8-9% globally, different averages, different estimates have been put forward, but that's the ballpark number for how much plastic we recycle, 8 to 9% globally each year. And there's about 1% of plastic that gets recycled twice in its lifetime. So the idea that we can actually recycle plastic is a fallacy. And there's a lot of health issues with that concept as well. So when we're thinking about plastic that we can see, obviously it's a huge issue based on what we already know, but another really concerning thing are these tiny particles that we can't see, known as microplastics.
I think a lot of people would be really surprised to hear the scale of plastics production, that it's doubled since 2008 because, you know, socially, culturally, we've become so much more aware of plastics use. I'd say in our day-to-day lives, we're more conscious about the plastic we use. Where is all of that manufacturing coming from and what's it going towards?
Yeah, it's a good question. So over 50% is single-use still. So there's myriad single-use products that are still made, including things like food packaging. And then there's this one of the second, well, I think it's the third largest is, which most people often don't make the association, is textiles. So anyone out there that wears athleisure wear, they've got their, I'm not going to say the brands because I don't want to promote them, but anyone that's wearing any type of spandex material, that you're pretty much wearing oil and gas. So polyester materials, polyethylene, they're essentially, the materials are made from an oil and gas backbone. We still have a huge reliance on it in things like food manufacturing. This is a huge issue as well. So if you think about our food systems now, we're highly dependent on food packaging, and obviously that's made from plastic. If you think about obviously Coke bottles or soft drink bottles globally, if you think about the level of consumption, there's still huge sources contributing to this. And one of the key issues, like I said, is that we often will purchase products that may have the recycling. So we call them the chasing arrow symbols, so the 3 arrows. And people look at it and it's a very clever bit of marketing. So people look at that and they go, oh, what a relief, it's got that recycling logo on it. I can drink this without harming the environment. I'm going to drink it and pop it in that bin over there and know that it's going to go back and be reused. And again, that's a fallacy. And, one of the things people need to become aware of is that, we can't unfortunately protect ourselves and the environment from the impacts of plastic through recycling. And that's because of the chemicals in them. And it's also because of the tiny fragments that break down from them over time. And we're learning more and more, but those tiny fragments are getting into us and they're bioaccumulating. So basically, we can't get rid of these little particles and we're getting more and more into our bodies.
I want to talk a little more about the specifics of the treaty in a second, but before we get there, can you speak to me about the health impacts of these plastics, particularly microplastics? As you mentioned, we do hear a lot about plastics polluting the oceans. We have that, the pollution that we can see and the understanding of its place in the environment. But what health risks does all of this pose to the average person?
Hello, my name's Sam. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and I started the Daily Aus way back in 2017 because I didn't think there was enough content just like this video available for young Australians online. And the truth is that there's still not enough, and we have a lot of work to do. And the best way that you can help us is by pressing subscribe to this YouTube channel. It is the best way to show us that you back us and that you back our future. Now, let's get back to the video.
Yeah, so thinking about plastic is sort of two main constituents, which is the first one is the backbone. The polymer backbone is made from oil and gas. So essentially plastic is petrol. So not many people realise that. So the main part of the plastic, the material that you're holding, be it a single-use plastics, 98% of them are made from oil and gas. But any type of plastic will have that type of petrol backbone essentially. And then there are all these additional additives I mentioned before included into the plastic to give it its characteristic depending on what it's trying to do. So things like PFAS, which has been in the media a lot lately.
Forever chemicals?
Yeah, forever chemicals, exactly. And another one which most people don't really know about is something called a phthalate, which is basically this class of chemicals that we know essentially alter our body's natural hormone. These chemicals are getting included into that oil and gas backbone that I mentioned before, with very little transparency on the reporting as well. So when these plastics are made, we often don't know what's in the plastic. But what we're now learning, which is probably the most concerning component of all this, is that the plastic particles are breaking down to these tiny fragments to what we call a microplastic. So you wouldn't actually see these particles in the environment. So they're essentially everywhere. And so a lot of research in the last 2 to 3 years has come out looking at both how they accumulate in our bodies, and so they get in and they don't leave. But we've just done a review last year looking at what are the health effects of these microplastic particles. And what we found were these really consistent effects in the respiratory, digestive, and also reproductive system. So we saw that it impacted fertility. We also saw they increased these biological markers in our body, things like chronic inflammation in both the lung and also in the colon. And so we saw these suspected links to these cancers. And so we're starting to see more and more evidence coming out to show that, once these things are in our body, it makes sense. They're oil and gas and these chemicals I mentioned before, they're going to lead to a raft of health effects, which is, the thing that is probably most concerning.
When it comes to the treaty, I suppose there are so many facets that you have mentioned as concern areas, from transparency to production to marketing. What are some of the big sticking points or the disagreements between countries in these negotiations, or between even countries versus health experts?
Sure. I mean, that's an interesting point about countries versus health experts at the moment. I think in Geneva, there's 335, last estimates, industry lobbyists, fossil fuel and chemical companies. And I think they're outnumbering academics at 5 to 1, or scientists at 5 to 1, and Indigenous communities at 10 to 1. So these negotiations are flooded by the vested interests of these corporations that want to produce plastics. And the main sticking point, very simply, is that these, a number of fossil fuel producing countries, this coalition of countries, which now includes the United States. They do not want to cap plastics production, very simply. They don't want to stop extracting oil and gas out of the ground. But if we aren't going to be using it for energy and transport, and the world starts transitioning, regardless of what the United States is currently doing, they need a new revenue stream. And plastics is the obvious one, because they can argue that we are reliant on them in society, and we have become, but it doesn't mean they're essential. The very simple takeaway at the moment is that they don't want to cap plastic, and over 110 nations at the moment do. And that's essentially where the treaty is still lying at the moment. Can we get agreement on this?
If the influence of these manufacturers and lobbyists is so intense, is there a middle ground? Is there a way to switch at scale?
But the actual rules of procedure and how the treaty is going to be finalised has been one of the main issues with it. Essentially, these countries are saying that there needs to be a consensus. So everyone has to agree. And the draft rules of procedure actually allow for what they call a qualified majority voting when consensus fails. So in other words, if you can't get consensus, can we get a majority of votes to essentially move the treaty language forward and start to finalise something that is legally binding? Because at the moment, this is the 5th meeting. It was actually meant to be the final meeting back in November last year, and again, language could not be finalised because there wasn't consensus. And so what may happen here is that there is, these countries just won't agree to consensus, and they also then won't recognise this idea of a qualified majority voting if it does take place. And so what may need to happen is the countries that are saying, look, we want to come up with a global plan on how we reduce plastics, is that they essentially develop it, and they're going to have to try to do that, with those countries removed from the process, because otherwise just nothing will take place. Unfortunately, we're just going to be in this essentially a holding pattern.
What role is Australia playing in these negotiations? Are we leading or lagging with the pack, and how does that tie into our own plastics manufacturing here? Yeah,
it's a good question. Australia at the moment is in alignment with the idea that there needs to be a reduction in plastic production, that we should be trying to cap to a sustainable level. It's a little bit vague in terms of, what our complete commitment is, and we certainly can still do a lot more back in Australia immediately as well. There's no reason why we don't immediately ban all non-essential plastics and single-use plastics in Australia. There's lots we can do in our current environment, which is important. Australia, unfortunately, we're not the huge players in this treaty, but the fact that we are supporting a reduction in plastic, I think, is important.
What are some of the key points that you think belong in a successful treaty? What would be your kind of priority areas for the most urgent things that if you could change tomorrow, you would enact?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious one, as we've talked about, is capping. This keeps me up at night because I don't think people fully understand how much this is going to impact generations to come, particularly if you have children, which I do. Even if we start to cap plastics, and even if we move towards reducing the volume, the amount that's already in the environment, this is the really scary bit. We can't get it out. It's in everything. It's in every type of soil sediment. It's in, the particles are so small in the ocean, they're already in our body. And so that for me is probably the most concerning piece. But we do need to take action. And so capping is absolutely critical to this. And there's a need to look immediately at non-essential materials. So just very simply, what is not critical for society to function? A critical piece of material may be something like a medical device, but even still there may be alternative materials that could be used. The second thing is chemicals. So we need to ban those immediately being used, because once they're into the plastic, as I mentioned before, we can't recycle those plastics if those toxic chemicals are in there, or it's incredibly difficult to do that. So essentially, once they're put in, we know that they're going to end up in landfill. And there needs to be global implementation of a database of chemicals that are identified as toxic, similar to the Stockholm Convention, where they just get banned. We can't use them. A third thing is the transparency around it. There needs to be reporting. So when plastics are made, we need to know what's in them. Currently, we have very little idea of how many additives are added into these plastics. And then finally, how are we going to pay for all this and implement it? And this is critical. This is happening. This is an issue, a key issue with a lot of environmental catastrophes similar to PFAS, where we have manufacturers and producers of these chemicals and these environmental contaminants that essentially externalise the costs. So what I mean by that is they can make it, they make it at a very cheap price, and then they sell it. We consume it, but then we pay for the health implications, both human health and environmental. And so we're burdened with the ongoing impact and cost of these products, even when we know that they're toxic like we do now with plastics. And so it's critical, it's really critical that the implementation of a treaty, but also just moving forward globally in terms of how we remediate and how we reduce the impact or repair the impact of these contaminants, is that the fossil fuel industries, the petrochemical companies and the plastic companies that are making these need to bear the cost for the impact that they're causing to the environment. So capping plastic, removing toxic chemicals, increasing transparency on what's going into them, and making the polluters pay for this would be the four main things I'd want to see in this treaty.
It can feel a little bit hopeless or overwhelming when we consider these ongoing negotiations, a bunch of faceless suits at a table overseas, trying to determine ways around this. What can we do, or can we do anything to actually make a difference, beyond just recycling? As you've mentioned, that's its own flawed beast. What would your advice be?
Put it on the ballot. We know that civil action and engagement around an issue can lead to change, because there are a lot of community action groups out there at the moment on this. And also, don't forget, consumer action will lead to a lot of manufacturers changing. People can talk to their local members. We need to ensure that governments know that this is something that potentially could lead to their position in Parliament changing. There is an opportunity for people to get around this as an idea and to get governments to start responding in a timely way, because if we wait 30 years and plastic production triples, the amount of plastic that's going to be in this world and this environment is going to be near impossible to remove. But we can take action, and certainly I think people being informed is more important than not having that information to make your own decisions.